And finally, Roman numeral 6. So you're going to prison. What we're getting into here basically is criminal law, which is something your book sort of ignores completely, which I think is kind of irresponsible because this is the sort of thing you might need to know someday. So, first things first, the types of crimes you get. Felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies are the more serious crimes. Misdemeanors are the minor crimes. Felonies are usually ones that involve jail time. Misdemeanors generally involve a fine of some sort. Felonies are usually graded by letter in North Carolina. Class A felony, Class B felony, and so forth. I think it goes all the way down to like J. The lower the letter, the lower the penalty. So a Class A felony is the most severe, usually involves life in prison, whereas like a Class J felony can be a couple of months in jail. Misdemeanors, on the other hand, are oftentimes classified by number. Class 1 misdemeanor, Class 2 misdemeanor, etc. Misdemeanors, again, can involve jail time, but generally involve things like fines, probation, and so forth. There are only 2 Class A felonies in North Carolina. I found this out once. One is first-degree murder, which is premeditated murder, and the other one involves using a weapon of mass destruction. So, I think that's just multiple degree murder, personally, but, whatever. So just don't get a nuclear bomb, people. Just that simple. So that's felony and misdemeanor. So, before you can be arrested and so forth, again, the police have to have a warrant. There are 2 types of warrant. A warrant is a permission slip from the court to do something. You usually have a search warrant first. A search warrant allows for them to come into your house and look for evidence. Now, with a search warrant, you have to be very specific what you're looking for. It's not just, let's go to Bill's house and look and see if we can find stuff he did for crimes. A search warrant is usually very clearly specified. We're looking for bloody clothes, a handgun, a knife with blood on it, things like that. Search warrant allows them to gather evidence on private property and so forth. Once they have enough evidence, then they go to a judge and say, here's the evidence and so forth, and they will oftentimes grant an arrest warrant. An arrest warrant allows them to arrest you. Now, once you've been arrested and so forth, in many states there's also what you call a grand jury. The grand jury, technically it should be pronounced grand jury because it's a French word, but, hey, we're American, we're not going to do that. The grand jury is the group that does not decide your guilt or innocence, but rather whether or not there's enough evidence to go to trial. So by presenting the case to the grand jury, the government is saying, is there enough evidence to proceed? But they're also asking what charges should be brought. So they're asking, should it be, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, which are all different things. That's called the indictment. The indictment is the formal list of charges. This is what we think you did. These are all the crimes we are accusing you of. Once you have been indicted for a crime, you then go to arraignment. Arraignment is when you go before a judge and you either say guilty or not guilty, or as we'll talk about, there are other options as well, but generally this is where you say whether or not you are what you are pleading. Generally, when you get to the arraignment, your options again are going to be guilty or not guilty. There are a couple of weird things, though. There's also what you call nolo contendere. Nolo contendere is sometimes also referred to as no contest. Basically means you're not saying you did it, but you're also not mounting a defense. So nolo contendere is usually used for misdemeanors, minor crimes, things like that. The difference between the two is that basically by admitting your guilt, you are becoming a convicted felon and so forth, whereas by pleading no contest, you're getting a lower penalty. You also don't have to be a felon in many states and so forth. Not every time will allow you to have no contest, but some states and some crimes do. The other thing you might have at the arraignment is what's called an affirmative defense. An affirmative defense is when you are basically saying yes, but with a reason. An affirmative defense is things like insanity, self-defense, extreme emotional disturbance. These are all called affirmative defenses because it's up to you to prove them. Generally, in a criminal case, the government has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. But if you're doing an affirmative defense, you have to prove that defense. The government doesn't have to, essentially, you have to prove you were crazy. The government doesn't have to disprove it yet. So that's slightly different. Now, there's also, again, of course, the option of a plea bargain. A plea bargain essentially cuts the trial out completely. And a plea bargain is a deal you make with the government. In exchange for pleading guilty or no contest, they will give you a lower penalty. That's usually the deal. So instead of going to jail for life for murder, you can go to jail for 15 years. That's called a plea bargain. The vast majority of criminal cases are solved by plea bargain because usually there's more than enough evidence that the other side just gives up. For the government, the reason why they do a plea bargain is because it's faster and cheaper. they can get a plea bargain and get you in jail for at least a period of time. That's better than wasting all the time, effort, and resources to put you on trial and maybe lose. Excuse me. So that's why they're willing to do a plea bargain, even if they have a lot of evidence. Once you get to trial, you have the choice between a trial by jury or a bench trial. In a trial by jury, this is what's called a petit jury. Again, if you were actually using the correct French, it'd be the petit jury, or the small jury, as opposed to the grand jury, which would be the big jury. But in any case, the petit jury is the one that decides your guilt or innocence. These are the 12 individuals, the jurors. The jurors, again, are randomly selected from members of the community. Once you register to vote, you are put on jury duty list, and you can get called up at any time. To actually be selected for the jury, though, you go through a process called voir dire. Voir dire is a process by which the lawyers interrogate the potential jurors, looking for biases or other problems that might keep them from being on the jury. Because during voir dire, you're looking for things that might bias them against you or, and for you, let's be honest. And those are the people you're trying to keep off or encourage to be on the jury. Now, in voir dire, the lawyers have a certain number of challenges they can make for no reason. They can just say, we don't like number 2. But they also can bounce them for cause. So, like, again, if you're on trial for rape and number 3 is a rape victim, you can say, look, she's not going to be impartial, or he's not going to be impartial. So we can push them off the jury and put in somebody else. But other times, again, they can just say, we don't like that guy. My brother got bumped off a jury because he was an Eagle Scout. Basically, they said that they thought he was going to be too smart to be on the jury, which I thought was sort of a fun thing, but not the point. Now, you also don't have to have a trial by jury. You can have a bench trial. In a bench trial, the judge determines your guilt or innocence. Most of the time, you don't want a bench trial because a jury, remember, has to be unanimous. It has to be everybody agreeing that you're guilty in order for you to be found guilty. The odds of you being able to convince one juror that you're not guilty is better than trying to convince one judge. So that's why most people would prefer a trial by jury if they get a chance. If it's not unanimous, it's called a hung jury. If it's not unanimous, it's called a hung jury. And that creates a mistrial, which means essentially it never happened. So again, that's why you would probably prefer to have a trial by jury, because convincing one juror out of 12 that you're not guilty is much, much easier than convincing the only judge that you're not guilty. So the trial goes on and so forth. But during the actual course of the trial, there's a different, what's called burden of proof. The burden of proof is what you have to prove in order to be found guilty or not guilty and so forth. In a criminal trial, it's called reasonable doubt is the burden of proof. The prosecution has to prove you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense just has to create reasonable doubt, meaning that your guilt is the only logical conclusion. What reasonable doubt basically translates as is your guilt is the only logical conclusion. It's the only conclusion that anyone who's looking at the evidence could dispassionately come up with. They're looking at it and they have to go, yeah, that's fine. Again, it doesn't mean beyond any doubt. So, as a result, like, your defense can't be Martians did it, because that's not a logical explanation. But you can present evidence that basically says somebody else could have done it. That's why in the defense in a criminal case doesn't have to show who did do it, just that it's possible you didn't do it. A civil case is slightly different. In a civil case, the burden of proof is called the preponderance of the evidence. The preponderance of the evidence is simply the majority of the evidence. So 51% of the evidence says it's your fault. So again, slightly different. And a preponderance of the evidence is much easier bar to hurdle than than reasonable doubt, rather. Reasonable doubt is like 90% of the evidence if you want to put it mathematically, whereas preponderance is 51%. So just looking at the numbers, it's obviously going to be much easier to win a civil trial than a criminal trial. This is why somebody might be found liable in civil court of wrongful death, but be found not guilty of murder, because the burden of proof is much, much different. As for outcome, again, in a criminal trial, it has to be unanimous, and you are either going to be found guilty or not guilty. Not innocent, but guilty or not guilty. If you are found guilty and there was a problem with the trial, you can appeal. If you are found not guilty, that's it, you're free to go. The government cannot try you again. That's called double jeopardy. If they cannot come to an agreement, if the jury cannot come to an agreement, it's called a hung jury and a mistrial is declared. The government has the option to put you back on trial, but oftentimes just won't bother. In a civil case, most states it still has to be a majority, but the actual amount that they award you, again, depends on the state. Some states do it by jury, some states do it by judge. In a civil case, though, I believe both sides can appeal if there's a problem with the case, rather than in a criminal case where it's only the defense who can appeal. So, I'm pretty sure that takes care of everything. Roman numeral 6 and the judicial system. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure you're going to need to be watching these videos because hopefully we'll be back by the time we get to the end of Unit 10, but in case we're not, here it is. So, bye!